An increasing number of people are coming forward who've contracted an asbestos-related condition based on simply working in buildings which contained the material. Many have thought in the past that it was only when asbestos was disturbed by repairs or rebuilding that it was dangerous, but hundreds of instances point to fibres being in the air wherever the substance is present.
We talked to Ian Naylor, whose wife Sandra is believed to have developed mesothelioma from exposure to asbestos dust when she was a pupil at Caldervale High School in Airdrie in the 1970s. Sandra died in 2014, aged 52.
My wife, Sandra, started to get some rather uncomfortable symptoms of pain in the early part of 2012. And she got a lot of pain going up into her shoulder and her neck on her left side. That didn't really ring too many alarm bells at that particular point until the pain progressively got worse and worse. And we literally went through quite a number of months of her getting various treatment, almost from osteopaths. It wasn't until she went for an X-ray for something else and they realised that they needed to do a ultrascan, and that showed up some fluid on the lung, and things went on from there really, where she was given the diagnosis at the latter part of 2012. She was diagnosed with mesothelioma. At the time we didn't know exactly what it was at all, and we had to ask the consultant, and they said, well, it's actually she's been exposed to asbestos at some time in her life, probably some 30 years ago perhaps. Very soon after we were given the diagnosis, she said, look, you're not going to believe this, but I've actually Googled Caldervale School asbestos, and up came this press cut which was referring to the fact that renovations had happened at the school in 2011, and they had to halt the whole process because of they found a lot of asbestos under the building in the main teaching block. So that's really where it all came about, that she, because at no other point did she think, oh right, I was in such and such a place or wherever where I might have been exposed to asbestos. So this was the thing that really rang the alarm bells. Everything pointed towards the Caldervale High School. One of the main things, and this was the amazing thing when we started to talk to Sandra about it, and a number of other pupils that Sandra knew, they all pointed towards the fact there was a lot of snagging going on at the school at the time. And I believe since then that the part of that snagging process was they were cutting asbestos. They were disturbing the asbestos. Even though Sandra vividly remembers there being plastic sheeting up and pupils being directed down different corridors to try and avoid areas. But unfortunately, like dust and fibres and various things like that, it's got a very uncanny way of spreading throughout. I would like the North Lanarkshire Council to recognise or admit some liability for the fact that back in the period from 1974 to 78, when Sandra was there at the school, that there was a process there going on that probably shouldn't have been going on.
Well, Mr Naylor is now leading calls for all prospective councillors to make the issue a priority and is currently taking legal action against North Lanarkshire Council. The council told us that as this is the subject of live legal proceedings, it would be inappropriate for the council to comment. Well, with us here in the studio are Annette Smith, who chairs Clydeside Action on Asbestos, Phyllis Craig, Senior Welfare Rights Officer with the organisation, and Robert Howie, an occupational hygienist who is an expert consultant on the deadly substance. Morning to all of you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Phyllis Craig, first of all, you're drawing attention to this just before the council elections. Why so?
Well, I think that's the very time to actually do that. I think that we've got to see that people are being exposed to asbestos or potentially being exposed to asbestos, and we're talking about children as well, as was with Mr Naylor's wife. So what we've got to ask the council to do is to perhaps consider having a long-term strategic plan whereby they will have the safe removal of asbestos for our children.
Mm-hmm. And Annette Smith, how many cases of mesothelioma do you know of in Scotland?
The numbers are actually rising, and at the moment we just haven't got a level just now, but it's certainly on the increase.
And do we know why that is? I'm just wondering whether as buildings age, perhaps, do the number of cases go up?
I think what's happening is that people think that asbestos conditions are on the decline because they associate them with the shipbuilding area. And what's happening is that you're seeing it in the construction industry. You're seeing joiners, plumbers and so forth going into old building. Now, in these old buildings, asbestos was put into the buildings in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So these people are going in when it might be in a dilapidated state. And what's happening is they are experiencing minimal exposure, but it still causes an asbestos condition some 15 to 40 years later.
Interesting. Robin Howie, are asbestos fibres dangerous even if they haven't been disturbed?
The reality is, if you look at any building that contains asbestos, even if it's in good condition, you will have a background fibre level. Buildings shake in the weather, they shake when people walk around. So you normally have something in the region of about 50 fibres per cubic metre in a building containing it in good condition.
And is that enough to cause, a serious condition?
Yes, it's enough to cause. Particularly if you look, depending on the type of asbestos. If it's brown asbestos or blue asbestos, the risk levels are very significant. And nominally, we've had guidance on building owners and local education authorities to manage asbestos in their buildings.
And so is that enough, really? I mean, it's almost as if I think the awareness is not clear enough perhaps to people about the risk, inherent risk, even if it's not being removed or not being tampered with. I mean, is it right that the schools, the hospitals, the operators of buildings should be responsible for it, or should someone else have an overall responsibility?
Well, you've got a bit of a, can I use the term, legal mix there. You've got a duty of building owners to people that are working in their, or visiting their buildings. We've also got legal limits set by the Health and Safety Executive. The snag is that the legal limits are very lax. I mean, to put it into context, let's say a building was being worked in and asbestos was being removed or being deliberately disturbed. Before that building can be returned back for reoccupation, there's got a very thorough inspection, visual inspection, and then a monitoring process to measure the number of airborne fibres. Now, the limit is defined as being less than 0.01 fibres per mil, which doesn't sound very much, but that's 10,000 fibres per cubic metre, which sounds a heck of a lot more. And if you work on the fact that someone in a building in a normal shift will be breathing between 5 and 10 cubic metres, they're inhaling a lot of fibres at what looks to be quite a small fibre level, but in reality has got quite a high level of risk attached to that exposure.
And Phyllis, it must be difficult though to prove, is it, where someone might have inhaled asbestos, or is it?
I think for solicitors it's very difficult for them to prove, especially when the exposure was minimal. However, it is done. Robin's speaking like a statistician, and I think that for us it's more that our clients are coming in to see us. They're coming in having had asbestos exposure, and so for our charity we want to eradicate that. And in the buildings, in schools and in hospitals and so forth, my friend who worked at Clydeside Action on asbestos was a GP, and she had 10 days exposure and died of mesothelioma. So that's what happened to her, and her case was settled. So it is accepted that minimal exposure can cause mesothelioma. But if you look at the report by the Committee of Carcinogenicity in 2013, they have stated that our children are more vulnerable in being exposed to asbestos. So why would we allow that? Why would we allow our children to be put in a position? So for us at Clydeside Action on Asbestos, we want to see a plan put into action for the safe removal of asbestos so that there is a future for the children.
And Robin, if it was known back in the 30s or 40s that asbestos was dangerous, you have to wonder, don't you, why it was still being used in almost all buildings for so long after that?
It was a peculiar, asbestos as it was used was a very, very good material, but we didn't enforce the regulations of the day. we also misconstrued the regulations of the day. Had we correctly construed the regulation, we'd have taken much more care. And we're now paying the bill for that. I mean, we're looking at, nationally, UK-wise, about 2,000 male mesotheliomas a year, and about 100, 150 female mesothelioma cases. Many of those cases have got very light exposures. So there is no such thing as a non-risk exposure. What we should be doing, in my mind, is very heavily enforcing the rules on building owners' requirements and to monitor fibre levels within the schools in particular and in public housing and set very stringent limits, something in the region of less than 50 fibres per cubic metre.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting to talk to you all.
Thank
that
you.
was Robin Howie, an occupational hygienist, a consultant on asbestos, and Phyllis Craig and Annette Smith from Clydeside Action on asbestos. Many thanks.
Thank you.